Hello everyone, Frank here, and I'm glad that you're here. Would you like to learn T-SQL so that you can query Microsoft databases, manage databases, understand queries that you see, know what they're doing? Well, in this video, we're going to look at my favorite book for learning and understanding TSQL, and we're going to take a look at how we can take the files that are used as demos in that book and load them into an Azure database so that we can use that Azure database to practice all the queries from the book. So my favorite book for learning TSQL is called TSQL Fundamentals. And this book has been around for quite a few years. It's currently in its 4th edition. And when you get the book, if you read through it, and in the introduction section, there's a set of files that you download in order so that you can go through the chapters of the book and practice using the different skills that are shown and taught in the book. So I think this is a really good thing to do. A lot of computer books have files that you can download, practice files, and this book's no exception to that. So when you get the book, you can get it from the Microsoft Press, or you can get it on any place that you get books. I'll put a link down below so that you can go and pick up the book. But when you read the introduction, there'll be a link to this site, and I'll put this link down below as well. And you'll notice that underneath the book, you can buy it right off the Microsoft Press store. It gives you a description and some sample content, but the downloads is what you want. And you can download all of the files that are then used in the book in all the examples that they're giving. It's a really good book. You'll need the book, of course, so you have to buy the book, and then you can run all these samples. So once we've downloaded the files, what I like to do is I could install SQL Server on my computer, but because I'm learning and I want sort of a lab environment, I will often put it onto an Azure SQL Server. There's a couple of gotchas there, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. We put it onto the Azure server, and then I can query from anywhere I'm at. I can just connect up with the web, and I can play with that database, learn how to use TSQL, and then when I'm done, I can just delete the resource, and it's all done. And it's only about $6 Canadian, $4 US a month for the database that I'm going to show you, or the server I'm going to show you. That's a key factor, so make sure you pay attention in the video. You can specify a much more expensive server. We're going to go with an inexpensive one because we're just going to be learning how to use TSQL. So once I've downloaded the files, I'll have those in my file system. I'll go to Microsoft Azure and I'll log in with my Azure account. If you're a student, check to see whether your school has Azure for Education. If they do, you can often get $100 US of free credit. If they don't, then this is still an inexpensive option for you. It could be expensive if you configure a powerful server, but we're not going to do that. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new resource in Azure. And when I create the new resource, I'm going to create a SQL server. So if I just go in, you'll notice there's some popular features or popular items here. I want to create a SQL database, so I'm going to click on SQL database. If you don't see it as the popular items, you can just do a search for SQL database, it'll come up. And there are some things that I want you to watch in this video. Make sure that you do these correctly because it can be a very inexpensive database. And if you have the student account, it can be free. So notice right now that this database will cost me about $361 a month in Canadian funds. You don't want that. That's way too powerful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose my subscription. And then I'm going to choose a resource group. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource group, and I'm going to call this T-SQL Practice. So it's going to be my T-SQL Practice resource group. Can't put a space in there, so I'll put that in there, and I'll create a resource group called T-SQL Practice. I won't go into all the details of what a resource group is, but effectively it's just the container object where my database is going to live. Underneath my database name, I'm going to call it T-SQL Practice. Just put that in there, and it's going to check to see if it's there. Now, I don't have a server, so I'm just going to create a new server. And all you're going to do is specify a few things about the server. So I'm just going to call it TSQL, and we'll see if it's available. It's already in use, so TSQL 4, and see if it's already in use, so I'll just call it Frank. So TSQL Frank, yay, we have a winner. So that has to be unique globally, so I'm going to put it there. It's going to be on the East Coast of the US. I'm going to use, now notice this is an important part. I could use Entra authentication, which is Azure Active Directory, but I'm going to use SQL authentication. I'm going to put in an administrative login. I'll just put in my name, and then I'm going to put in a super secret password. And let me put it in. And the thing with the super secret password, I think I just messed it up, is that this is the one you're going to need in order to log in, right? You're going to need to log in using SQL Server Management Studio. I'll show you how. So you want to make sure you remember this password. So you put that in there. So do they match? Yes, we're all good. And then I'm going to go OK to this, right? Say OK to that. And then it's going to ask a couple of other questions here. So it's going to go in and ask about the resource group in here. This is the big important part here. See how it's $361 a month Canadian, which is about $8 US. No, I'm just joking. It's still several $100s US. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to configure the database with the compute and the storage here. And what I'm going to do is, instead of hyperscale, I'm going to go to basic, very basic. And look what my price now is, $6.65. So that's a big difference. That's not a bad price to pay. That's my estimated cost depending on how much I use it. It actually usually comes in much less than that. So I'm going to apply that to make sure I'm using the cheap seats. I don't need a powerful server, basic. I cannot emphasize that enough. And then I'm not going to worry about backups and such. I'll go into my networking. Now, networking, you wouldn't normally put your database, sort of hang it out on the internet, but I want to connect to it. So I'm going to say public endpoint. Remember, this is just a learning and a practice database. I'm going to delete this once I've practiced with the files, and I'm not too worried about this database in terms of security. That's another conversation if we have a real database, which I'll normally keep behind the public endpoint. Anyways, I can go in here, they can access files, that's fine. And this is an important one as well. I'm going to add my current IP address. So if I'm here in my studio, my IP address will be the public address that I use. You want to add it in there. Now, if you do go to another location, when you go to log in, it'll say, hey, this IP address is not recognized. Do you want to add it? It'll give you that ability, but I'll just add it right now. So this IP address for my studio is going to be able to connect up. You'll see that when we connect up to the database. And then I'll go into security, and underneath, I should go back one, just make sure everything here is good. Yeah, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go into security here, and I'm not going to worry about any security stuff on here. Like I say, I'm just playing around with this database in order to learn TSQL. Underneath additional settings. Now, I could, if I wanted to, put a sample database on there. It would create a database based upon the AdventureWorks LT database. But remember, I'm going to load up the database from this book. So I don't need the sample database here. I don't need to make any changes here, really. I don't need a lot of tags because I'm not really using this for production. So I'm going to go review and create. And I'm really going to emphasize I have $6.65 a month. That I can handle, and I can go in here, it gives me information. I'm using a SQL authentication. I've got it set up here so that I'm not, it's a basic machine. This is what I care about. In this case here, I'm adding a current address on there. I'll make sure I blur that out. And then we'll go in and we'll create this database. Okay, so I'm going to create this database. And now it's going in, it's going to initialize the deployment of the database. And now it's going to start creating it for me. Okay, so now it's deployed that database, and I'll go to the resource. There's a few things that are going to be very important for me to take note of. So I go to the resource, and you'll see here the server name is right here. So it's tsqlfrank.database.windows.net. I'm going to copy that. So I've copied the name. And then what I'm going to do is open up SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll open up SQL Server Management Studio, and I'll paste that name into the name of the server, and I'll make sure that I'm on SQL Server Authentication. Remember, we did that. My name is my name, so I'll put in the name that I created as the admin account, and then I'll put in my super secret password. Okay, so I'll put in the super secret password, and then I'll connect. And what's happening now is I'm connecting from this computer to that Azure SQL database. Because remember, I allowed my IP address to go through. I have a public endpoint, and now I'm connected up. And you'll notice I don't have any databases here. Well, I've got the practice database. So I've got TSQL practice in here. So you've got that in there. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to connect up, and I'm going to install the database and everything I need to work with that TSQL Foundations book. A great book. I've been using it for years. So I'm going to go into my browser here, And so I downloaded the files. So I'll go into my downloads. I actually put it into a shared file on my sync.com account. So I'll just bring that up. So here we go. And what I did is I put it into a folder so I know where I put the files. I extracted the files, but you'll notice here that there is a file at the bottom here called, and you go down to the bottom. So with the 4th edition, there's a file here called TSQL v4 or v6, right at the very bottom here. So TSQL v6. Now, if you have an earlier edition of the book, it might say used in all chapters, but here it is here, and I can open this up. And when I open this file up, it recognizes, because of the .SQL extension, and because I have SQL Server Management Studio installed, it opens it up in a query window in SQL Server Management Studio. You could easily do this in Azure Data Studio as well. It's just a query, and it's using the SQL language, and it's going to come up and you'll see the query window. And you'll notice it says that it creates a sample database. And the important part here is there's a section A, a section B, and a section C. Now, section C you're going to use for no matter what you're doing, whether it's a local database or a cloud database, an Azure database. But section A you're going to use, it's just the determining whether you're going to use the box product, the one you've installed locally, or whether you're going to use an Azure one. So here, I'm not connecting the box product. So I'm going to scroll down, right? And it says section B is for Azure databases only. So that's what I'm using, but you'll notice it's commented out. And if you didn't know anything about SQL, you might not know this, but if you see a SQL query that's green, that's comments. And this case here, it's a comment block. So I'm going to take out the /dot. I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to take out the slash or the /. So that's the query block. And notice here that some of this code now becomes non-green. So I have blue code in here. I can just highlight this code here, and then I can come up here to execute that code. And when I execute that code, I'm connected to my Azure database. That code is going to execute. You can see that it's executing the query. And then what's going to happen is once the query executes, I will now have a database in Azure called TSQL Frank or whatever I called it. It's actually TSQL v6. So it'll be TSQL v6. In fact, it executes the query. If I go to databases, I right click and I go refresh. You'll notice that it should pop up in a few moments here. It's still executing the query. It can take a little bit. Remember, I have a basic database, and it does take a little bit to use this query to make sure it executes. I'm just going to refresh it here a few times. There it is. It just popped up, right? So you can see I've got the database here, and now that query is executed. I can see that it's created the database. That's really all that matters. And in this case here, you can see it says, you cannot use the use statement. Don't worry if you see the red. All that matters here is that you've got this TSQL v6 database created. That was the main thing to do. Now you'll see I've got this whole section. Where are we hiding here? So this whole section here, if I go down a little bit further, section C. And I use that for both the SQL Server box and Azure. So what I want to do now is highlight section C, and it's quite a big section, but I want to make sure that I go into TSQL v6 because that's where I want to execute the query. You'll see what I mean in a moment here. So I'm going to grab section C, right? So I'm just going to go in here and I'll go back here. So section C, and I'm going to hit shift and go down a bit. And then I'm just going to page down all the way to the end. It's a huge amount of code. So I'm just going to, I'm holding the shift key and the page down key until I reach the end of this query. This is going to create all the tables, the views, the data, everything that's going to make the book files work. So in the book, when it says, run this query, it's going to allow me to run that query and get results that I would expect to see. So I'm going down to the very bottom here, and it's important that I highlight everything. So I've got it all the way to the bottom of section C. And here's something I like to do. I right click. So I right click and I copy it. You might be like, why don't you just execute it? Well, I want to make sure that I'm using the TSQL v6 database. So I'm going to right click on the TSQL v6 database and I'm going to say new query. And then what I'm going to do is going to give me a new query window. I'm going to paste that section C that I just copied, and I'm going to paste it in. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because with Azure, you cannot switch context. I can't do something called the use command. So I can't say use the master database, then use TSQL, then use this database and that database. You have to actually right click on the database and execute the new query command. So I've done that now. So what I'm going to do is I'll execute it within the context of the TSQL v6 database. And now it's going to build everything I need to start using this book and start learning TSQL. And I'm going to be able to execute queries. Once this query executes and I actually have all of the objects built, you'll see that in the files for the book here, so I'll just bring those files up again, you'll see that there is a folder for every single chapter that I go through. It's just still executing the query. Oh, did I hit the execute? So I am connected. And oh, let me go here. So make sure I have that and we'll execute the query. I wound up opening a new query window. So you can see here it's executing the query. So this is, you can also see, by the way, when I have this query window open, that it'll tell me that I'm connected to the TSQL database. So now it's executing this query. It's going to create all the objects. You notice it's there. And if I go into the TSQL here, right? So if I go into the database and expand it, if I go into my tables and expand that, you'll notice that I have a whole bunch of tables in here. So the customer tables and employee tables, again, all of the stuff that I need in order to work with the book. And then speaking of working with the book, if I go into the file folder where I have the files, notice that it has all of the chapters. So for example, here's chapter 1, background to TSQL query. And if notice they're all SQL queries. If I double click on that, right, it'll open it up in a new query window. So it'll open up in a nice fresh new query window. And you'll see these are the queries from the book. The book will explain the queries, but I can go in and you can see that I have this query here. You can highlight a query and I can execute that query. So again, I execute the query and I can get a result and the book will explain to me, you know, what are some of the things that are happening when I do that. Generally, if you want to go in, the book will explain all the steps along the way. I'm not going to reiterate or run all the queries of the books. So the idea here is that I've now created this nice little sandbox that I can work with. But I want to say one thing before you go. It is always important once you run any code that will go back to the properties, the compute and storage of this database that I have. And I want to absolutely make sure that it is sitting here at basic and $6.65, just so that I'm not burning through any of the credit that I have on Azure. So you can see here, $6.65 is my estimated cost per month. It'll suspend itself if I'm not using it, so you'll generally come in at a much lower cost than that. But if I ran it completely, it would be $6.65 a month in order to learn TSQL in Azure. So I hope that was helpful. And if it was, you can hit the like button. You can subscribe for more videos on how we can learn and teach better using technology and some of the technologies that are fun to teach and work with. And I'll see you in the next video.